Hello, hello. I'm Casey, and as you can see, there's no Fallon here. For those of you who are watching the actual video, for those of you who are listening, you cannot see, but Fallon is not able to be with me for this episode. She's got a little bit of illness moving around in her house. So fingers crossed that everybody gets to feeling better very soon and she's able to be with me on the next one. But for now, you just have to deal with me all by my lonesome. Hopefully that's not creepy. But I guess I'm not like alone. I got my dog here. There's Ayla. Hi, Ayla. So if you see moving around in the background, nobody panic. It's just me dog. Today is going to be the first episode of the 50 States series that, if you've been watching, you know we've been talking about. And the very first state in that series is Alabama. So I did a true crime case out of Alabama, and I picked one that I had personally never heard of that I thought was pretty interesting. So hopefully you guys do too. But before we get into that, I thought I'd try something a little bit different for just the 50 States series. And if you guys don't like it, please feel free to comment or let me know. And if you don't, I'll flip it back to doing what I've been doing for all the other episodes. So I thought that instead of doing a fun fact with these, I might try to inspire a little bit more listener interaction and engagement, or get your brains rolling a little bit more. So I thought I would go with kind of like philosophical questions or questions about life or things that just might get your brain really rolling or thinking or reflecting for a minute. So let's give that a try and see how we like it. If you don't, I'll reel it right back in and we'll flip right back over to the fun facts. So my question for this episode is, how do you know when you're being really, truly authentic? Like, in what moments in your life do you know without a doubt you are 100% being true to yourself and whoever you may be engaging with? For example, when I tell my husband or my kids that I love them, even if it's 1,000 times a day, I know I'm 100% authentic every time I say it, because I mean it every time. I know I love them with my whole heart, but that seems kind of like a cop-out answer. So, and by cop-out answer, I mean it's the answer everybody would hopefully give, because you hopefully all know that you love your families from the bottom of your heart, and you're truly authentic when you say that. So for just this question, let's take the loved ones out of it. And let's think about, how do you know when you're out in the world or you're engaging with strangers or doing something that you're being truly authentic when you do it? Food for thought. I don't expect you to respond to me personally. Like, by no means am I trying to make you guys feel like you need to respond, but obviously I would love if you did. That would be a great conversation to have, but you're not obligated by any means. It's more just hoping you guys maybe have a little personal insight for yourselves on these questions, if I continue to do them. But I would like to hear your answer. If you want to share it, that would be great. So feel free. But the point is just to get your brain rolling and thinking and inspire you to truly reflect on yourself for a few seconds of the day. That being said, and my ranting being done, and hopefully you've taken a moment to ponder that question, let's dive into the case. This case is called Nannie Doss, aka the Giggling Granny. And again, in case you missed it, the first state that we're doing in this series is Alabama. Nancy Nannie Doss Hazel was born on November 4th, 1905. She was later referred to by several different things, such as the Giggling Granny, the Lonely Hearts Killer, the Black Widow, and also the Lady Bluebeard. She was born in Blue Mountain, Alabama, to Louisa Lou Hazel. And although James Hazel is credited as being her father and who she knew to be her father, he wasn't her biological father. In fact, Nannie was actually already born when James proposed to Lou, and she would end up being the oldest of 5 children. She would end up having 3 sisters and a brother. All of these kids would have a pretty difficult childhood, but Nannie by far would have the worst one of all. Being the oldest and the only non-biological child of James, she was definitely treated differently, and a lot more of the responsibility and expectation was put on her throughout her whole life because she was the oldest. See, James had a farm, and he depended on that farm for everything. Unfortunately, more often than not, that farm wasn't very fruitful. So instead of viewing his family as, well, a family, he more so viewed them as laborers. He would require Lou to spend pretty much every spare minute she had working in the fields until Nannie was old enough to start picking up some of the work, which, by the way, his idea of old enough, she was 5 when he had her out there clearing debris and doing the same kind of work he and Lou were doing, and with every kid born, the same level of expectation was there, but not necessarily the same level of enforcement was used. Along with his strictness when it came to working on the farm, he was also abusive in general to the kids and Lou, and he was extremely controlling. The girls were not allowed to dress as girls. They weren't allowed to fix their hair up or do their makeup. He wouldn't allow them to go anywhere alone or without him or their brother. He wouldn't let them go to school during any harvest times of the year. The only real reprieve Nannie had on the farm were the romance stories she would read in her mother's magazines. She would read those stories for hours. Despite all his abuse and sternness, when it was off-season and there wasn't any work to be done on the farm, the family would often travel to visit relatives. One of these trips in particular was a trip Nannie would never forget, and it would change her forever. The family had decided to go south to visit James's side of the family, but when they chose to go, a winter storm was moving in. They opted to take a train for their travels, and while on the train, at some point, the train would abruptly slam on its brakes due to the storm causing a tree to fall on the tracks. When that happened, Nannie was thrown forward out of her seat, and she hit her head on a metal bar that was right in front of her. She would black out for the rest of the train ride and wake up in her uncle's house. From that moment on, Nannie would experience frequent severe headaches, blackouts, depression, and sometimes she would fly into an uncontrollable extreme rage that she would just kind of have to wait for it to subside on its own. She didn't know what to do with it. It was clear she had a concussion and some significant damage from hitting her head, but James refused to let Lou take her to the hospital, claiming that they couldn't afford the hospital bill. So Nannie would just have to learn to cope with the side effects over time. These side effects weren't the only ones that came from this accident. Nannie was now seeing the world from a whole new perspective, and all of her father's controlling ways and favoritism towards her siblings, along with his abuse, was now front and center in her eyesight, and this would be the first time she would feel hate. She began to hate her father with everything she had. Once she developed this anger towards James, her focus became to find someone who truly loved her. She became obsessed with her romance stories that she read and imagining a world where she too would be swept away by a man who would love her forever and take her away from the farm. She had an idea of how she wanted to be treated, but she had to figure out a way to get out from underneath James's thumb and see what she would actually come up with is that she would recommend to James that she should get a job in town so that they would have a steady flow of income all year round, regardless of whether they had harvests or not. And to her surprise, he agreed to let her do it. This would be the first taste of freedom that Nannie would get. She began working at a linen factory. It wouldn't take long for her to attract a fella. In fact, she would attract her first husband there, 17-year-old Charlie Bragg. And again, to her surprise, her mom and dad actually really liked Charlie. She thought she'd done it. She finally found her hero. They were going to get married, and he would take her away from the farm, and they would live happily ever after. Unfortunately for Nannie, that's not exactly how that would play out. After just 4 short months, the couple did get married, but there was a little hiccup that Nannie wasn't privy to before they wed, and that was Charlie's mother, Mrs. Bragg. Nannie didn't know that Charlie and his mother lived together, and Miss Bragg had a very specific idea of how her son should be treated by his wife. She had super high expectations of how her son should be treated, as well as how the house should be kept, and despite her claimed illness, Miss Bragg saw to it every day that Nannie was living up to those standards. Because of his mother, the marriage was rocky from the jump. Like, literally, starting from the morning after the wedding, when Miss Bragg basically demanded Nannie to make Charlie breakfast before he left for work. Like, when Nannie came downstairs, Mrs. Bragg was sitting at the table, and she was like, "Hey, where's his breakfast? He's fixing to go to work." And Nannie was like, "Huh? What?" Anyways, the couple couldn't make any plans together because as soon as they did, Mrs. Bragg's illness would magically flare up every time in one way or another, so they'd have to cancel. And another thing Miss Bragg did that really sent Nannie over the edge was when she destroyed Nannie's romance magazines, claiming them to be smut or equivalent to cheating. In order to cope with the stress of living with Charlie's mother, Nannie began drinking, which in turn caused her depression to get worse. But despite that, Nannie would push through the moods and do her best to live up to her mother-in-law's impossible standards, at least for a little while, until the couple began having children. Once that happened, the power kind of shifted in Nannie's favor. She now had a foolproof reason that Miss Bragg couldn't ruin her marriage and a tie that even Miss Bragg couldn't break. They would go on to have 4 girls. The first in 1923, her name was Melvina, and the last in 1927, and her name was Florine. And with every pregnancy, she would grow to hate Charlie and his mother more and more. Nannie began doing whatever she could to escape. She started going to bars and sleeping around with any man that made her feel pretty, bearing in mind that Charlie, too, was stepping out on the marriage, and Nannie knew all about it. When it came to the stress of caring for 4 children a year apart, all under the age of 5, and an essentially absent husband, it became too much for Nannie to handle, and by this point, Charlie's cheating had gotten worse. He would stay gone for days at a time. Sadly, over time, Nannie started to believe that her biggest problem and the reason she could no longer get out of the house to try and find true romance or focus on herself at all was simple. She had too many kids. Life was much simpler when she only had one. Nannie absolutely loved and adored Malvina. But the other 3, in her mind, they were expendable. So, the next time Charlie went on one of his outings. By the time he got home, the couple's two middle children were deceased. The doctors knew it was food poisoning, but they couldn't really explain how or why, other than they were the only two that had eaten porridge that morning for breakfast, so perhaps the grains in it were somehow contaminated, which is kind of what they came to the conclusion of, so they threw out anything that had grains in it in the house, assuming that that's what had caused the problem. Florine was still breastfeeding, so she didn't eat it, and Malvina ended up getting toast. So I think I read. Nannie would end up looking like a strong but grieving mother, and Charlie who showed up back the day the children died, only to find the bulk of the town in his house consoling his wife. He would be shunned by the town for his lack of presence when the children died. For a moment, Charlie fell into this new line of shame that had been bestowed upon him by almost everyone around him. Everyone except Nannie. When he looked in her cold, empty eyes, he knew she had killed the girls. And he feared for himself and his other two girls. So he fled, and he took Malvina with him. And you may be thinking to yourselves, why didn't he take Florine? Florine was actually sleeping in the bed with Nannie, like in her arms, so he wasn't able to get her. But if he could have gotten her, he would have taken her. Malvina was the only one of the kids that Nannie truly cared about, so him taking her absolutely devastated Nannie. Charlie was gone for a year. Now, during that time, his mother would grow sicker and sicker, and Nannie would take up work at a local sawmill to try to make ends meet. His mother would pass away before his return. Again, her death wasn't questioned because everyone knew of her illness and just assumed she died from that. So, Nannie wasn't even given a second glance. Charlie came back in the summer of 1928. He wanted his house back and a divorce. He didn't come back alone, though. Thank God for him. He had his girlfriend, Malvina, and his girlfriend's son with him. Nannie would begrudgingly take the couple's two children and move back in with her parents. This is when Nannie would go back to reading her romance magazines, but she was looking for real romance, not articles. So that's when she found the Lonely Hearts column. Sound familiar? Sound like one of the nicknames I mentioned in the beginning of the episode? And this column is where people, mostly men, would put out ads looking for love. She quickly responded to some of them, and this is where Franklin Harris enters, aka Frank. Things started off exactly how Nannie had always dreamed a relationship would. He showered her with gifts and gave her all the attention she could ask for, and he even wrote her poetry. 2 months later, the couple were engaged. After the wedding, the new family moved to a cabin just outside of Cedartown, Georgia, where Frank had just gotten a job. Nannie would quickly discover that Frank had a bit of a drinking problem. As their marriage moved on, so did Frank's drinking. He began staying gone more and more to drink with his friends. One night, while out drinking, Frank would get into a fight and find himself arrested. When Nannie went to go get him, she discovered that this was not an isolated incident. In fact, she found out that he had been arrested several times in Florida for barroom fights, and that's why he had fled the state to start a new life. Nannie was furious. She then tried to help him stop drinking, but this backfired. Led to him going and drinking a lot more. He started going on binges with his friends. 4 days at a time. Sound familiar? So that's when Nannie decided if you can't beat them, join them. So she started going on benders with him. Malvina, at the time that this started happening, she was a teenager, and usually she was at a friend's house. But Florine was just kind of left to fend for herself. And this caused Florine to be taken from the couple by the police and delivered to Alabama to live with her father, Charlie. Nannie immediately stormed to Charlie's house to get her daughter back. This little episode seemed to end Nannie's drinking, but it certainly didn't stop or slow down Frank's drinking in any way. That's all about the same time frame when Frank became abusive, not only to Nannie but to the girls as well. And that would go on until Melvina got married and left the house. She would marry a man by the name of Mosey Haynes, and a year later the couple would have a baby boy that they would name Robert Lee Haynes. He was born in 1943. And this gave Florine a reason to leave Nannie and Frank's house as well. She moved in with Melvina and her husband to help care for little Robert. By 1944, Melvina was pregnant again, and Nannie was enraged. She felt that a second baby would be too much too soon and burden Melvina more than she could handle, the same way having children so close in age had done to her. Nannie despised this baby from the second she knew of it. In July of 1945, Melvina would experience an extremely difficult labor. In doing so, she wanted her mother by her side. After hours of labor, a baby girl was born. She was born healthy. Melvina passed out from exhaustion from the hard labor she had just gone through, leaving Nannie to look after the baby. Within an hour, the baby had died. The doctors concluded that the baby must have gone without oxygen for too long and couldn't make it independently. However, upon arriving home, Melvina would express to Florine and Mosey that she had had an awful dream, and in it she saw Nannie take a pin out of her hat and push it into the soft spot of the baby's head. That's when Florine told Melvina that when she had re-entered the hospital room after the baby had passed, she witnessed Nannie fiddling with a hat pin in her hands. Both girls decided that those thoughts were impossible. There's no way Nannie would ever have harmed the baby, and that was that. And they kind of just tried to suppress that and move on. After this happened, Melvina and Mosey's marriage quickly began to crumble, and Melvina would begin sleeping with a man outside of her marriage, leaving little Robert in Nannie's care more and more. One weekend, Melvina had brought Robert to Nannie's to drop him off for a weekend stay, as she had been doing, so she could go be with her lover. And Nannie and Melvina got into a huge fight. Melvina would eventually get frustrated and bark at Nannie that it was her life and she'd do what she pleased, and Nannie needed to butt out. Then Melvina sped off, leaving little Robert in an extremely